manufacturing superpower that doesn't need help from anyone. A military, especially a navy, that could take on and defeat the United States. On the verge of having the global currency. All of this is utter horse.
Fair. Why don't we start with any one of those? And actually, one of the topics that I was going to bring up was de-dollarization, or the BRIC reserve currency, which I also happen to believe is a pile of nonsense, given that it is underpinned by two dying commodities countries plus the most indebted country in the world.
You're being very kind to them.
That's right. So you led with a very cheerful prognostication, which is that we are within the last 50 years or so
10
of the end of China.
Yes. Where should we start? Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Let's kind of do the historical backdrop, because that'll kind of set the stage for everything else.
Perfect.
In the world before World War II, you had a series of competing empires who had good land and good internal transport and a technological edge, and they dominated the world, and they fought over everything. And those fights brought us World War II, and it all came crashing down. And then the Americans found themselves facing Stalin, and were like, oh, he's kind of scary. We're going to need some people to stand between us and him. And since everyone who was a potential candidate who had just gotten out of the world's most horrific war, they needed some incentive. So we paid them. We used our Navy, the only Navy of size to survive the war, to patrol the global ocean so that anyone could trade with anyone else and access any commodity in any market at any time. In exchange, you had to side with us against the Soviets. And that created NATO and the Japanese and the Korean and the Taiwanese alliance. And ultimately, by the time we got to 1980, it involved China as well. That political and security deal is globalization. And the Americans have been backing away from that now since 1992. So the fact that the Americans saw it as a security deal, everyone else saw it as an economic deal. The Americans never invested their economy. Everyone else did. You can see where I'm going here. Mm-hmm. Without that sort of security overwatch, none of the rest of it works. That's only piece one, though. Piece two is when everyone started trading, they started specializing. And when we were all living under an imperial system, most of us were farmers and kids were free labor, and you would have as many as you could, plus one, because that's how you found out you had too many. But when the world started to urbanize and industrialize, we started taking manufacturing and services jobs, and none of those were on the farm. They were in town. And when you move into town, kids go from being free labor to a free source of migraines. So you have fewer. Fast forward 75 years, the world isn't running out of children. That happened 40 and 50 years ago. The world is now running out of working age adults. And countries that joined this system later, that started urbanizing later, could basically pick up the idiot's guide to making a city and do it a lot faster because the technology had advanced. There were more countries with experience. And one of the last ones to do that was China. So the Chinese urbanization experience really didn't get going until 1980, but it happened so fast that in a single generation, they've gone from an average of 5 to 7 kids to, in places like Shanghai and Beijing, 0.7. And so we're looking at complete population collapse across a lot of the world. But in China, it's going to be so dramatic, it's also going to trigger civilizational collapse. They no longer have the young people to consume or build. Their labor costs have gone up by a factor of 15 since the year 2000. And they now are on the verge of being the grayest country in the world without any replacement generations coming up from behind. So the idea that they can be the world's largest economy is it's silly, even if you believe Chinese statistics. And the last time the Chinese issued a bit of an oops, they disclosed that they overcounted their population by over 100 million people. So,
kind of a lot.
Yeah, the scale of the disconnect here between reality, Chinese statistics, and popular belief is just shocking.
So when we look at a place like China versus another country in, I guess, what you would call a secular or demographic decline like Italy, is it because the amount of disparity between the haves and the have-nots is so wide that compact is breaking down?
Well, the have-not thing doesn't mean as much when you are in a dictatorship. So, I mean, social stability, political stability matters, but they're really in a one-man government system and they have a cult of personality. So it's certainly there kind of grinding under the surface. It's not a plus. But if you had the degree of economic inequality of China in a place like Germany, I mean, things would break. I think it's more of an issue that Chinese agriculture was never particularly productive. It was very, very labor intensive. It was basically think the Jews in Egypt in 4000 BC or whatever the year was. You know, it's slave labor where people are living a subsistence existence under the tutelage or control of the state. You can only go one way out of that because there was so much labor. It was actually pretty productive per hectare. But now that everybody's moved into a city and everyone's been in a city for 20 years, they've forgotten how to farm like that. They can't go back. And the type of agriculture that the Chinese need to grow their food in the areas they need to grow it can't be mechanized very easily. So we're looking at a population collapse and a food collapse. At the same time, we're likely to see a manufacturing collapse and a political collapse. I mean, there's a long list of bullets that are in the magazine that is in the gun that's pointed at China's head right now.
So why don't we pivot just about 100 miles to the east?
Sure.
And we'll look at Taiwan. So Taiwan, to me, I mean, obviously there's a lot of saber rattling. Do you view that to be a response to domestic pressures within China?
Well, remember, China is a one-man state now, so it's really hard to decide what the political system even means anymore.
Fair. Which would you describe, I just want to make sure that we set the table right. Would you describe that as being a 5-year phenomenon, or is that something that you feel is consistent since the time of Mao?
Oh, no, it's been a progressive thing. So when Deng Xiaoping took over after the death of Mao, he had a collegiate cooperative group, a really large political elite that ran the country, because he never wanted to see it return to the one-man state of Mao and the horrors of the Great Leap Forward and the Cultural Revolution that killed, tens of millions of Chinese and set them back 50 years. He wanted to do something different. And so he set the stage for the China we know today, which is the industrial power. And he gave way to a pair of guys, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, who represented different factions. And each of them ran the country for 10 years, and they were chosen by Deng while Deng was still alive. So Hu knew he was going to start in this year and finish in this year, and he knew that 15 years before he got the job. And that has worked reasonably well for them. But Deng realized he couldn't see forever. So he knew that by the time they got to the next guy, he wasn't going to be able to choose that person. So he assigned the Zhang faction and the Hu faction to come together and pick jointly someone new. And that is Xi Jinping, the current guy. So Xi Jinping, originally, it was thought that he was going to be in the middle of a tug of war between these two big factions. He spent the first 5 years of his presidency destroying those two factions. And he spent the next 5 years of his presidency destroying any other pole of independent power